Thanks for tuning in for this episode, Post-Tragedy Lessons Learned. Hi, I'm your host, Laura Beth Ezel for HxGN TV, and today joining me is a very special guest. This is Mr. Joe Jonas with the fire department in New York City, also known as FDNY. Mr. Jonas was inside the North Tower when it collapsed on September 11th, 2001. Now he's here to share with us his story of survival and discuss how events of that day have changed the way they now respond to an emergency. Jay, we thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
First, just tell us a little bit about your background as a firefighter and your current role now at FDNY.
Well, I have currently have 37 years in the New York City Fire Department. I have, since September 11th, I've been promoted twice. I'm currently a deputy chief assigned to the 7th Division in the Bronx. And I'm responsible for half of the Bronx and the Washington Heights and Inwood sections of Manhattan.
So tell us about, your story of how you responded to the attacks on that day at the World Trade Center back in 2001, and what particularly happened to you and your team.
Well, on September 11, 2001, I was still a captain assigned to Ladder 6 in the Chinatown section of Lower Manhattan. And we responded as soon as we heard the first plane hit the North Tower. And on our way, we could see how big of a tragedy this was. And it was a little intimidating. Even all the fires that we responded to over the years, this was beyond what everybody ever thought that they'd be responding to. And we got there, and the threat was very real. And we entered the building, and you just had a kind of a sick feeling in your stomach how bad this day was going to be. And just before I received what my orders were going to be for the day, that's when the second plane hit the South Tower. So whatever thoughts that we had that this was a horrible accident were gone.
Right.
Now we had a second plane hit the other tower. So we knew we were under attack. We knew this was not just a fire, this was war. We knew we were at war with somebody. We didn't even know who we were at war with.
Right.
And what a lot of people don't realize is that after the second plane hit the South Tower, all bets were off.
Right.
Is there going to be a third plane? Is there going to be a fourth plane? We didn't know. So we hit the stairways thinking that we were going to get a hit again. And our mission was just to get as many people out of that building as we possibly could.
You said y'all went floor by floor. You said 10 floors at a time was what you were trying. You got up to what, the 27th?
We made it to the 27th floor. Our target floor was the 90th floor. That's what the first plane, American Airlines Flight 11, struck the 93rd floor. That was the lowest floor. And we didn't make it. We didn't make it up to that point because we got to the 27th floor, and that's when the South Tower collapsed. And that was the sister building to the one that we were in. And it got hit after my building. So all of a sudden we realized that our mission is not workable. It's not doable.
Right.
So we decided to evacuate, and we didn't quite make it out of the building. We made it to the 4th floor. We were in the middle of rescuing a woman. We picked her up on the 20th floor while we were evacuating, which greatly slowed us down.
Right.
And it was, ironically, even though it slowed us down to the point where we didn't get out, it kind of put us in that one little safe spot within the building. We didn't know it at the time, obviously. And we were able to, we survived the collapse. We were trapped for 4 hours afterwards, and eventually we got out.
I know that you've shared your story many times over the years and talking to a lot of people about this. What do you think is something that people don't realize who didn't experience this or go through it on that day?
Probably the one thing was the human element. Every firefighter that went into that building knew that there was a real possibility they weren't coming out.
Right.
And they went to work anyway. They had dedication to duty. They had love of their fellow man, that they were going in there no matter what to save their fellow man. And I think back on the events of the day. Every time an anniversary comes up, friends of mine kind of look at me cautiously and say, "How you doing?" I said, "I'm doing great." The more time goes on, I think about the very heroic things that happened that day. And even though I was there and I was a part of it, it sends chills up my spine thinking what my fellow firemen did that day. It was the biggest urban search and rescue effort in the history of the United States.
Right.
Unfortunately, most people who participated in it were killed.
Right.
And it was strictly for the love of their fellow man that they entered those buildings. And I can speak from experience. We were terrified.
Right.
Absolutely terrified. This was. We're used to calamity. We're used to crawling down hallways with fire blowing over our heads. We had never experienced anything like this, as did nobody did any place.
Right.
This was. They were weaponizing airplanes.
Absolutely.
To inflict as much death and damage as they possibly could.
FDNY has always been a very close family. I assume those bonds have grown closer over the years since this.
Yes. Anytime you experience a tragedy, it draws people closer. So, and those who were there that day, we look at each other. We kind of a wink and a nod. We just look at each other. We know we have a shared experience, and it's not uncommon to see firemen at gatherings, at Memorial Days, Medal Days, things of that nature, and seeing grown men just hugging each other, saying "I
Right.
love you," and then it's great seeing you. Every day I see you, it's a blessing.
Right.
And that's very real.
Right. What lessons has FDNY learned from the 9/11 response and experience?
Well, to the fire department's credit, even though they were still very much grieving from the losses that they had on that day, they conducted a study of how we could respond to something like this better. And to my knowledge, they've implemented almost all the recommendations from this study. And they've improved communications. We relied upon the repeater system within the World Trade Center to be able to communicate to the upper floors. Well, that was destroyed.
Gone. Yeah.
Got destroyed with the first plane hit. So any new high-rise building that's built, they have to install a repeater system. We have repeater systems in all our chief cars. So if we don't have a building to use for their repeater system, we can accomplish the same things with a chief's car. They've improved interagency communications. It was almost non-existent before September 11th because you couldn't conceive of that kind of evil. Now we do. Now we know that there are people out there who are devious and that they will stop at nothing. So we have interoperable capability with other agencies, and it's greatly enhanced what we do.
And that kind of answered some of our next question was, can you speak to enhancements in training technology? And obviously interoperability is something we're hearing more and more about.
Yeah.
That's happened since 2001 and
Right.
mandates being put in place for agencies to be able to communicate with each other and go across lines.
Yeah. Before September 11th, for the most part, interagency communication was strictly face-to-face. Now we can communicate via radios. And ironically, the people who probably had the best observation of what the threat level was were people who were remote from the location. So you were on the scene and you just got swallowed up in the events that were right in front of you.
Right.
So the people at headquarters, they probably had a better handle on how bad the situation was. We had an emergency operations center for the city, but ironically, that was at the World Trade Center site, and that got destroyed. Now they've moved to a different location. And so this way we can have better intelligence, better real-time information going to the field units, so we can get a true level of knowledge of what's in front of us.
Is there anything else that you would like to share with our audience about, things you've learned from that day, and how can we prepare for the unknown, which is absolute, that was such an unknown that day. Like you said, nobody had just ever experienced that.
Unfortunately, we tend to prepare for the last event, not the next event. And so we have to be plugged into the intelligence apparatus of the United States to see what they're anticipating, and they're doing a good job in keeping us informed and trying to prepare for what's coming next.
All right. Well, Jay, we really appreciate you sharing your story with us, sharing your expertise and what you've learned, and for still your service that you're giving now. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
To learn more about this discussion, you can go to www.hexagonsafetyinfrastructure.com, and to watch additional episodes, you can go to HxGNTV.com. Thanks for tuning in.